Hi, and welcome to the very first episode of PIIE Insider Live. I'm Anjali Bhatt. I'm the Communications Manager and a Research Fellow here at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I often say that one of the best parts of my job is that I get to just walk into the offices of some of the world's top economists and just ask them questions, and then they answer. So here with PIIE Insider Live, you get to come with me to ask those questions and get those answers that you won't hear anywhere else. And we're starting right at the top with PIIE President Adam Posen. Today, we're going to be talking about what's next for the global economy after the US election, what Adam has been hearing from people around the world, as well as what this means for PIE. I'll be taking live questions as we go along, and we'll have some time at the end for questions too. So go ahead and submit those via the Zoom Q&A function. So, hi, Adam.
Hi,
Welcome.
Anjali. Thank you. And thank you to you and the team for launching PIE Insider Live. I think it's going to be great.
We're very excited. So let's just start with, the election. We're about a week and change out. You go to any fancy Washington watch parties? What was that like?
Well, a few elections ago, I went to my first super duper Washington watch party for an election night, and I met this nice person. They started telling me all about the national parks, and I was like, oh, that's cool. Why do you know so much about the national parks? I'm the Secretary of the Interior. So I've generally avoided fancy Washington election parties out of embarrassment since then. My wife and I were with her family. We had Thai takeout,
Nice.
not taco truck, but Thai takeout, and went to bed early. Um, More broadly, professionally, people seem to have given a clear mandate. So that means one of two things is going to happen. Either Trump administration, as some people have been saying, including officials have been saying, are not really going to do the things they said they were going to do, which I think probably would be a good thing. Or we're going to have a really interesting economic policy experiment.
Yep. Yeah, it's going to be real interesting the next 4 years. So since the election, and like you said, it was a decisive election, so we've known what's going to happen now. What stood out in the media coverage for you so far, and what do you think people should be paying more attention to?
In terms of the election, thinking about the election, what some people may have seen is this chart that's been running for a while, which is that the perceptions of the economy are running on parallel but completely different tracks depending on whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And it's been published a lot in the last few days that they literally just
Yeah.
and that's kind of incredible.
Yeah.
To think that so either the question's not right or we don't understand how people perceive the economy. I mean, they're free to do whatever the heck they want. But we'd like to think that if we have data on unemployment, inflation, and so on, that matters. The second thing that's come out a lot since the election is new looks at data, which show pretty clearly that despite a lot of good news, actually a lot of people did lose in real income terms. So over the last 4 years, net rise in prices versus net rise in wages. And it's kind of disappointing that that wasn't clear ahead of the election, but that would make sense that that's part of what made people vote the way they did. Our colleague Jason Furman, who splits his time between Harvard and Peterson, did a very nice Twitter thread and some columns on this. Some other people have come out now with the data. And it is pretty clear that there were a lot of people, even though things improved a lot over the last couple of years, who ended up feeling behind because of the price level shift. The things that I hope we at Peterson can encourage people to look at more is particularly the migration issue. If the Trump administration does do mass deportations, and we can get into what form that would take, we think, leaving aside the human issues, leaving aside the law issues, we think that would be very destructive economically. And I don't think people have really understood how potentially big that effect is. It's not just, oh, these are foreigners taking jobs away from Americans. It's the exact opposite. They're taking jobs at a price level in terms of wages and conditions that most Americans won't do, and other Americans are employed. So it would be a very big shock in certain industries in certain parts of the country. It would be a different kind of China shock. The final thing I would say, and this is the international aspect, which of course is part of why PIE is here, is other countries have agency, not just China. Our allies, what are called non-aligned countries, and certainly our enemies like Russia and North Korea. And I think both the Trump administration and people are underestimating how other countries might react. So in the short term, they may all say, okay, we don't want to be on the bad side of the US. We don't want to be on the bad side of President Trump. And it may look like he's going to get a lot for his threats. But medium term, meaning 2 to 4 or 5 years out, I think the reverberations could be quite large. And again, that depends on whether they do what they said they're going to do. If they end up not doing it, great.
So on that point of, whether they're gonna do what they said they're gonna do or not, some people are arguing that, the policies they put forward, especially the tariffs, are more of
Yeah.
like a negotiating tactic, right? And as we said, these third countries have agency. Do you think that they see these as a negotiating tactic? Do other countries believe, these tariffs are gonna happen, and are adjusting accordingly? What's going on there, you think?
Yeah, I think they do.
Mhm.
I think, they hope they won't. But a lot of major economies, the governments of major economies are making plans to sort of preemptively
Mhm.
make offers of various kinds to the Trump administration. We saw that the government of Japan under the late Prime Minister Abe essentially did this at the start of the last Trump administration, and it played a key role in both Japanese and American perceptions of a tighter alliance, and that Japan wasn't as subject, was still subject, but wasn't as subject to some of the tariffs and other things. So I think Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, Canada are, and maybe some others, are likely lining up offers. And these offers will be in the form of, we'll promise to buy more natural gas from the US. We promise to buy more weapon systems from the US. We promise to move more production to the US. And these will things, and so the ideal outcome, to be fair, for the Trump administration is they've made this set of threats, but they don't actually have to implement them, and they get these goodies. Now, there are two problems with this. One is getting these goodies is really not necessarily going to solve a bunch of problems. The number of the people close to the president-elect believe trade deficits are a really big deal. These measures are likely to actually increase U.S. trade deficits because they'll drive up the dollar, they'll drive up inflation. But the second problem is, and this goes back to what you and I just said, Anjali, about agency. This is not a one-round game.
Yeah.
Once this happens, even if initially they don't have to put on the tariffs, the question is, how do economies adapt, and how do they cope with the idea that the school bully is trying to take their lunch money away? So maybe they do it once and they walk around trying to get around the school bully in future. Maybe in that sense, trade and migration and investment initially flow into the US, but then people start building the US out. And so I think that's something that we're going to have to watch.
Okay, so let's talk about inflation. Inflation obviously was a really big issue in this election. Price levels, as well as perception of price
Yes.
levels and wage gains. A lot of the research we've done here at Peterson says that Trump's policies are likely to be inflationary. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think there's a fair pushback from a lot of people in markets and some of the Trump people who are either advising or likely to go into the Trump administration, that there wasn't that much inflation from the tariffs when they first put them on. The inflation came later with the supply chain disruptions and with COVID. But the fact is, the tariffs that were put on were actually pretty small as a share of total US trade in terms of levels. So essentially, you got, if they do put on tariffs, and they're what are called across the board tariffs, meaning you're hitting most parts of the world economy at once, then it's hard for the US, either consumers or businesses who rely on these imports, to substitute. And then the price level goes up. Now, there's also a factor that we're already in what's pretty close to a full employment economy, where we're at, unemployment rates creeped up a little, and that matters, but it's still low 4%. And in that economy, if we push up demand, we may not have the workers to fulfill it. We may not have the spare capacity in various industries. And so that will also probably push up inflation. And then again, on migration, think of it as what economists would call a segmented labor market. So it's not that everywhere removing migrant workers and particularly undocumented migrant workers, it's everybody. And if they initially only deport 50,000 human beings, which is a lot in human terms, that's not a huge part of the workforce. But if you've got industries, mining, fruit and vegetable agriculture, food processing, like the famous chicken processing plants in Arkansas, hard, low income parts of healthcare and hospitality, caregiving. If those get hit because you're scaring workers and employers, small business employers and households not to hire migrants, it isn't like there's a huge amount of native or documented labor ready to move into these low income jobs. And so that also will cause inflation. And sometimes they say, well, that's good, wages will go up. In a sense, yeah, that's okay. I wouldn't mind paying more. But in another sense, when we saw this, it's like the supply chain disruptions during COVID. You have localized shortages. And so in a mining town, in a fruit and vegetable farming town, in someplace in Arkansas with a chicken processing plant, or more broadly, small businesses in towns who like run caregiving services for people, that you could just basically have the equivalent of a supply chain disruption. Suddenly the labor, which is the input to this services that people value and need, is gone. And locally, the effect is bigger because just like with the China shock, it may not affect the whole economy that much, but the local big employer gets hit and local demand goes down. Finally, one thing which I'm watching with concern is, as many people I know realize from their personal lives, one of the biggest sources of inflation that people were upset about in recent years is housing price inflation. Rents, buying houses, all of that went up lots.
Confirmed.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's there.
Yeah.
It's in the data. This isn't perception. But it's very big in people's concerns. And one of the things, this is something Vice President Harris tried to talk about, but I obviously wasn't persuasive or successful enough, is that we need to increase the stock of housing in the US. We need to build more housing, rental and for sale. And except for large scale apartment buildings, that's mostly done by small businesses and locations, individual contractors, and most of their workforce is migrant workers, often undocumented. And the skilled trades, as they're called, for native and documented workers are mostly unionized and mostly in commercial construction. So we could end up with a shortage further of housing supply, which would compound, you contract supply, demand is the same, prices go up. Not to be cute about it, but that's a channel I think is going to be important over the next couple of years.
I mean, I think the Trump administration also is saying that their mass deportations is a housing policy, like that they're arguing that, their mass deportations mean that Native people can afford houses because, foreign-born workers are buying the property. Yeah, okay. That's not really.
Again, I mean, the thing is, there are markets like energy where the Trump administration coming in may have some points. And where it's an undifferentiated product. Right. So the gas at this station or that station, or for that company, the natural gas going to that plant or this plant, it's basically the same. But there are other products, and labor markets and local residential real estate are what we call segmented markets, that it's not easy to substitute. You have a particular kind of labor you need for this job. You have a particular kind of housing in this place that's short or not. And then you combine those. This is why I wrote about in Foreign Affairs that the Trump proposals, if executed, are essentially a negative supply shock. And yeah, sure, if it wasn't a segmented real estate market, if the migrant workers were mostly, competing with native and documented local workers for housing, you could see some effect. But the fact is, you've got two effects. One is they're mostly in a different segment of the market. I mean, the motel 2 blocks from my apartment is a short run stay motel, or was until it closed, for migrant workers. And it was fine. I mean, it was literally 2 blocks from my apartment. It was fine, but it wasn't anybody living in there who was living in my condo.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that as a value judgment, it's just empirical.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, whenever you're talking economics, you got to talk about the relative size of the effects. So it's one thing for the Trump people to say on energy, for example, we think we're going to increase energy supply by this much through deregulation, and that will drive down prices by this much. And then we can have a debate about, what is the actual number, and we'll find out. But in this case, if you're constraining supply, and if the migrant workers, for the most part, are in low-end housing that isn't what most native or documented workers are in, it's not going to work.
I'd also like to remind our viewers online, please send your questions using the Q&A tool instead of raising your hand, please. So let's talk a little bit more about different industries. So we talked about housing, we talked a little bit about energy and deregulation. What's going to happen for some of the other larger industries in this country? Deregulation, the tariffs, or the broader suite of policies. How is that going to affect different industries?
Well, I mean, the tariffs first cut is in favor of what are called upstream versus downstream industries. So say we're protecting steel production. That's good for the companies that produce the steel, and that's bad for the companies that use the steel. And repeatedly, whenever we look at this, and it comes up every few years, there's roughly 10 to 12 jobs in steel using industries for every job in steel producing industry.
That's like the first thing I worked on when I came to PIIE.
It's an evergreen. Unfortunately. And that also shows you part of the problem with tariffs, that every time they put them on, it doesn't save the US steel industry. They still are coming back for more. But anyway, that happens with different ratios across the economy. And so it depends on the particular industry. And so some industries, the US is selling very high-end products or intellectual property, and your Apple iPhone, your Hollywood movie or your video game, those things, the input costs are very low. It's mostly human things. It's not, the tariffs aren't going to affect them very much. On the other hand, this is where we get into what I would call asymmetric trade warfare. If the US says, well, we don't want steel, we don't want batteries, we don't want EVs from China, and we don't want them from Mexico starting from China, then the Chinese can say, well, we don't want Hollywood movies, we don't want American video games, we don't want American accounting firms. And then the services industries get hit. And so it depends how it unfolds, but there's very little there. The first round effect of the tariffs we impose on ourselves are mostly about making foreign inputs to our lives that we are obviously paying for, that profit earning firms and sensible households want more expensive. Because the whole idea is if you don't make them more expensive, you're not going to stop buying them. The other piece is then the second round, the retaliation, or even not necessarily retaliation, that companies, households, investors in other countries choose to make different choices. The final thing is there's been leaks that the likely US Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, and his crew are going to claim, well, look, people say that tariffs cannot make new industries expand. And that's not true. Nobody has ever claimed that. They're not usually very effective at it, but they do expand in local industries. The problem is the 10 jobs for everyone, the 10 companies for everyone that gets protected.
Okay, so we have a bunch of questions coming in here, more about the foreign aspect and our relationship with our foreign allies, especially in Asia. So if you could talk more about retaliation, global supply chains, how are different, what are you hearing from all of your contacts all over the world? What are they saying about how they want to handle this?
So as I mentioned, Anjali, and I'm glad our audience is thinking in those terms, a lot of countries, a lot of governments and international businesses are planning. I think there are a number of countries, I mentioned some, UK, Japan, South Korea, Canada, Singapore, basically like-minded US allies. They're probably just going to try to make nice with Trump. And because in a sense, as I understand it, their mental picture is we're going to be aligned with the US on national security and therefore against China inherently. So given that, it's not clear we should be maintaining that much pro-China. We should just go in with the US and then try to be on the inside of a fortress America economy and grow with them. So this is what the Nippon Steel deal, which isn't going through at the moment, but this was the idea.
Yeah.
They would be an ally supporting steel production in the US, and then they would grow with the US.
It makes sense.
No, it makes sense. For other countries, Mexico has a special relationship, unfortunately for Mexico. The old quote about so far from God, so close to us, that Mexico is in deep trouble, frankly, I fear. Because there's so many issues where the Trump administration is going to play hardball with Mexico on the border, on drugs, on their new judiciary reforms, on their energy deregulation or lack thereof, in addition to blocking Chinese investment in Mexico, and then reviewing USMCA and raising the barriers. So I fear very much Mexico's going to be in trouble. And I'm not sure how they're going to react. China, again, special case. Elon Musk, who apparently is got very good access to the president-elect's ear, is going around saying to people in China, you know, count on me, I'll keep things from getting out of hand. Okay. Again, if it's like them deciding not to do the policies they state. If US-China conflict can be limited or have guardrails put upon it, well done, because no point in having lots and lots of collateral damage when we don't have to. But I think that the big issue, I would say, is emerging markets and developing countries. So the big emerging markets, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Poland, Turkey, possibly Nigeria in this category, possibly South Africa. They have more agency, to use that word again. They've had more space, both geopolitically and economically in recent years. You really see it now. India's asserted itself, but most recently Indonesia. And the Biden administration did a terrible job of engaging with these countries. They kept using rhetoric like, you're our friends, we're going to friendshore, you're our allies, we're going to do this. And then they didn't offer anything. And so Indonesia is a perfect example of this. It was basically a non-aligned country, but it was getting more market-oriented, slightly more Western-oriented. And the Biden administration failed to deliver, as our colleague Colin Hendricks has written about, on deals about nickel and other key minerals or investment. And so now they just announced a deal with the Chinese on their maritime and them exploiting the resources in the ocean around them, and just generally a closer relationship with China. And I think we're going to see a lot of that. And so these big emerging market countries with geopolitical strength are going to do actually pretty well, and they're probably going to successfully play off US and China. The rest of the developing world, and this is very sad, is going to be in trouble. And especially if on the macroeconomic side, as I've implied, and our colleagues Olivier Blanchard, Maury Obstfeld, Joe Gagnon, and I all come to roughly the same conclusion, we expect there's going to be higher interest rates in the US. And that will also drive further problems for the developing countries who are in debt.
Okay, well, there's so much there.
Yeah, sorry.
We're getting up on time. So before we take any last questions from online, I just wanted to zoom back into us here at the Peterson Institute. We've done one Trump administration. What did we learn from those 4 years? What are we going to do? What are your priorities moving forward? What are we going to do?
I mean, our commitment is to be intellectually honest economic policy. And what that means is while we have opinions, we are willing to admit when we get it wrong, and we use data to decide when we get it wrong. So, you know, for whatever we advocate and whatever individual members of the staff do, and that's a key point, there is no one PIE position. That's why I mentioned several of us agree on a forecast, because often we don't. But whatever we do, and whatever the pubs team, which you and our team work on, which is great, you know, in terms of charts and explainers and short videos, it's going to be fact-based. The second thing we're going to do is, and this is a real priority for me individually, but also for several members of our team over the next 6 months, is this issue of what we're calling third nations, which are governments outside the US, outside China, in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America, that have room to make decisions and try to help them navigate. And along the way, work with things like the World Trade Organization or the BIS or the IMF and the World Bank to try to maintain as much space for a relatively free, relatively rules-based, non-bullying, open world economy for those who want to be part of it. And if the US and China don't want to be part of it, again, that's their right, but we think that's bad for those countries and bad for the world. And so we want to keep that positive space going. And then finally, for PIE, I mean, it's things like what you're doing here with PIE Insider, and I hope you'll have a more concise speaker as your next guest, is just trying to keep the conversation going with the American public. You know, what is inflation? How do we know?
What are tariffs?
What are tariffs? How do we know? And update on a regular basis and just try to create common understanding. And then if people decide, I don't care about the economics, or border control is more important to me than the economics, or I really feel like my household has really suffered, you know, we're not going to dispute any of those things. What we're going to try to do is provide people with the facts about the economic aspects, and then they can make up their minds however they want in future elections, in their own activities.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but we can take maybe one or two questions from the audience here. So let's see. Christina Liu is asking, how long would it take the U.S. economy to recover from Trump's mass deportation plan, if it can? And what would be the impact of those mass deportations in the long term?
Yeah, it's a very real question. Thank you, Christine. Again, it comes down to how much they actually do. So what we've modeled, colleagues Warwick McKibben, Marcus Nolan, Meg Hogan, and also separately a colleague, Michael Clements, who works specifically on migration, have looked at these issues. And, you know, if they literally deport 1.3 million people up to 8 million people, the US goes into recession. Sharp recession in manufacturing, because there are these pieces of manufacturing for which these workers are not able to substitute easily. Disruption to small business investment. You get stagflation. In fact, you get a sharp rise in inflation and a sharp decline in growth and real income. If they deport only, and again, this is only in the economic sense, 30, 40,000, and they do visibly march them across the border, or build internment camps as a means to signal and scare people. My view and several of our colleagues' view is the direct effects will not be 3% of 1 million people. They will be much higher. And that's frankly what the Trump people want. Again, if it's a negotiating tactic, the goal is you're trying to affect somebody's behavior. You're trying to affect the employer's behavior, you're trying to affect the migrant's behavior. So it won't be 3% of that, but it probably won't be 100% of that. So we'll have a relatively mild recession, a relatively mild contributor to inflation. The longer term, which rightly raises, is how much do we then deter investment in the sectors where migrants have played a key role? How much do we deter migrants wanting to come to this country? How much more burden of spending on policing and enforcement? I mean, again, staying narrowly in the economics. And we know that migrants are some of the most entrepreneurial people, innovative people, have helped this economy grow enormously through the years. We know that despite what's said, and this is a fact, migrants on net create jobs for natives. Migrants on net reduce government deficits. So there's a whole bunch of negative effects that will persist.
Well, on that cheery note.
No, but we have to close out, but just let me say, I mean, this is the way democracy works.
Yep.
All we can do is try to set out what are the economic costs, and ideally, at some point, if the costs are as bad as we say, and we hope we're wrong, the American people decide it's not worth those costs. And at various times, for example, on immigration, the American people have reversed restrictions through the years. I'm hopeful that they will again.
All right, on that actually more cheery note, we are at time, Adam. So thank you so much for giving us an inside look at asymmetric trade wars and migration and inflation and all of these many things that we covered, as well as what's next for us here and me and my job.
You're in your job.
So this was the first episode of PIIE Insider Live. So you guys let us know, what did you think? What do you want to see next? Let us know at meetings@PIIE.com. And if you're not already, subscribe to the PIIE Insider newsletter at PIIE.com/subscribe. So thanks again, and we'll hope you join us next time.